When you do a deep dive on the Jets defense, it becomes clear what positions this team needs to prioritize this offseason. Let's break it down today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, February 7th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today our episode is brought to you by FanDuel. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. On today's show, we're going to take a deep dive on the Jets defense. We're going to take a look at how the unit performed in 2024. We're going to talk about changes Aaron Glenn may bring. And the reason we're doing this is to figure out which positions this team should prioritize this offseason. We're going to take a look at Jets coverage units. We're going to take a look at the Jets run defense. But let's begin by talking about the Jets pass rush. And I'm going to begin by giving you a statistic that may surprise you. It's a statistic called adjusted sack rate. And essentially that's how many opponent passing attempts, what percentage of opponent passing attempts result in a sack. And the Jets actually finished seventh in the NFL with a 7.62% sack rate. And I'm sure that surprises you just from the standpoint that you probably watched the Jets this season, and for much of the year, it felt like the opposing quarterback had enough time to stand in the pocket and eat a steak dinner. There were many stretches during games where the Jets pass rush was completely ineffective. But on the whole, the Jets did finish with a 7.62% sack rate, which is good for seventh best in the NFL. And there were some standout performances, most notably Will McDonald, who in his second NFL season posted a double-digit sack total. I think that the truth probably lies somewhere in between. The Jets probably were not quite as good as that 7.62 sack rate would suggest. But there is definitely more talent on this defense than what we saw with our eyes through much of the season. Now, McDonald looks like a player. I don't know. I actually don't know, despite his success in 2024, whether he's a guy you can count on consistently to get double-digit sacks. In fact, I almost feel like Will McDonald ideally would be a guy who kind of would slide into the Bryce Huff role and play 40 to 50% of the snaps. And I think that some of the Jets' issues in terms of having enough players who could get to the quarterback probably led them to play McDonald too frequently. And McDonald's a guy who can get to the quarterback because he's kind of established a couple of moves that complement each other. You know, you don't need 5 different pass rush moves to be an effective pass rusher. Really, if you have 2 moves that complement each other, you'll do fine. And Will McDonald has 2 moves that will complement each other. He's got a good speed rush, which essentially just you fire off the ball, you try and get to the corner. You know, if you have good bend, you can get underneath the block of the opponent. And he also has a spin move, which means you fire outside, you force the other guy to overset because he thinks you're going to get the speed rush, and then you spin back inside. And McDonald has kind of like mastered those 2 moves. McDonald's not great in run defense, though. But I think, you know, when we talk about the Jets having success getting to the quarterback, it probably to an extent came at the expense of their run defense. And part of the reason it came at the expense of the run defense is that the lack of other pass rushers performing for this team probably forced them to play McDonald too frequently. I think McDonald's part of the solution for this defense, but the Jets maybe over-relied on him a little bit too much this past season. And you look across the rest of the unit. Quinnen Williams is a very talented pass rusher. He had a very up and down season. There were some games where he looked a lot like the Quinnen Williams of old, but there were a lot of games where he was just, you know, kind of a non-factor. And I actually wrote an article this week on GangGreenNation.com about Quinnen Williams. And one of the things that I think the Jets need to do is diversify his usage a little bit more. The Jets kind of moved him around on obvious passing downs like third downs to try and get him one-on-one matchups. The way the Jets defense worked last year, essentially they were running the same front an awful lot. And this front, this front has the defensive tackle line up at one of 2 spots, either the 3 technique, which means you're on the outside shoulder of the guard on your side, which means you're going to get a one-on-one because the tackle's probably blocking the defensive end. If you're on the outside shoulder of the guard, there's nobody who could really help him. The only guy who could help him was the tackle who's occupied. And then the other spot you'd line up is between the center and the guard, which pretty much means you're going to draw a double team because the center and the guard can both block you. Quinnen Williams, when he lined up a tackle, lined up almost exclusively on the right side. And the way the Jets determined who stood where was essentially based on the strong side of the formation, which is generally determined on where the tight end lines up. So what does this all mean? It means that Quinnen Williams was always lined up on the right side. And whether he got the double team, whether he was in the double team spot where both the center and the guard would block him, or whether he was in the one-on-one spot where he was on the outside shoulder of the guard, was determined by the offensive formation. And if you're an offense and you can manipulate the defensive formation like that, it's pretty easy. Quinnen Williams got double teamed 62% of the times because he always lined up at the right tackle spot, and the offensive formation dictated whether he was going to get the double team or whether he was going to get one-on-ones. So essentially, it became too easy. I think Aaron Glenn needs to kind of diversify the fronts the Jets use and diversify Quinnen Williams' usage. And I don't think that that alone explains why Quinnen Williams had a down year, because the Jets were running the same defense in 2022 and 2023 when he was great. But I don't think what the Jets did last year helped. I don't think the Jets lining up, being so predictable with their use of Quinnen Williams is going to help him all that much. But I also think that the Jets could stand to get Quinnen Williams some help. I don't know if Mason Graham out of Michigan is going to be there when the Jets draft in the first round, but I think he'd be a great fit. I think he's almost a perfect player for the Jets, because he'd be a great tandem guy to go with Quinnen Williams. Because then if you're double teaming Quinnen Williams, Mason Graham's going to get a one-on-one. I also like the idea of Quinnen Williams kind of in the prime of his career. Mason Graham would be a rookie, so Quinnen Williams could kind of be the guy. And then as Quinnen Williams ages, Mason Graham will age into like a prime level player. I don't know if Mason Graham's going to make it all the way to 7, but I think he'd be a really good fit for the Jets on defense, because that defensive tackle spot next to Quinnen Williams was a huge hole this past season. Javon Kinlaw did not do the job. The Jets thought they were buying low on Javon Kinlaw, and they've overpaid, if anything. Javon Kinlaw was not a factor. Then you look to the other defensive end spot. You're hoping Jermaine Johnson bounces back. He had an 8-sack season back in 2023. He made the Pro Bowl. He's coming off an Achilles injury. Jermaine Johnson's an important player for this defense. But I think with the Jets, you want to have 3 starting caliber defensive ends. I think Will McDonald's a good guy. He's kind of like a part-timer, a guy who can. You have Jermaine Johnson, who's a 3-down guy, but in an ideal world, you'd be able to get an extra defensive end along with that. So I think on the defensive line, the Jets really need 2 players. They need a starting caliber defensive end, and they need a starting caliber defensive tackle, hopefully a really good defensive tackle. But beyond that, Aaron Glenn likes to blitz a lot. Aaron Glenn ran the defense in Detroit that blitzed more than any other team in the league. So I started doing a little digging on this. And what I found is that Aaron Glenn blitzes a lot. He doesn't blitz a ton from the secondary, though. For the most part, the guys he blitzes are linebackers. And Jack Campbell was the linebacker who blitzed the most. And on passing downs, Detroit had him kind of line up as an outside linebacker a lot, kind of in a rush linebacker role. And I wonder if that's the role Quincy Williams will have. Maybe the Jets will utilize Quincy Williams' speed on blitzes, and maybe Quincy Williams can help add to the pass rush this next season. And part of the benefit of blitzing is not just that you're sending extra guys to the quarterback. It's that you're kind of taking away the offense's opportunity to double team, because normally you have 4 pass rushers versus 5 offensive linemen. So somebody gets double teamed. Now, if you add a 5th pass rusher, maybe that's another area that's another thing that can help Quinnen Williams get one-on-ones. It's the type of thing that can kind of unlock him. Or the other team has to leave an extra guy in, and you make their passing game less effective. So the Jets have pieces in their pass rush. The Jets scheme will probably add to their pass rush next season, but they probably could use another piece or 2 to really take this thing to the next level. And here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to a aspect of the Jets, which I complained about a lot last season, but it's also an aspect where the statistics are surprisingly decent. I'll explain why the numbers are deceptive when we talk about the Jets' run defense as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are some of your relationship green flags? We often hear about the red flags we should avoid, but what if we focused on identifying the positive signs in our relationships, those green flags? If you're not sure what they look like, therapy can help you identify them, actively practice them, and even embody that green flag energy yourself. Whether you're dating, married, building a friendship, or just working on yourself, therapy can help you form relationships that love you back. Therapy helps you develop healthy boundaries and improves your communication skills. It empowers you to set clear expectations and express your needs in relationships. Therapy provides tools for managing conflict in ways that strengthen your connections rather than break them down. And BetterHelp makes it easy by offering online therapy with over 30,000 licensed therapists to choose from. And if you need to switch therapists, you can do so at no extra cost. Discover your relationship green flags with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you every dayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Just because the season's over does not mean we're stopping. We're going all the way through the offseason. Jets are preparing for an offseason where they're kind of trying to reset. They're trying to revamp their roster. And I felt like it would be a good idea to look at the defensive performance in 2024 and figure out what they need as the team transitions from a Robert Saleh, Jeff Ulbrich defense to an Aaron Glenn defense. Now, let's talk about the way the Jets stopped the run, or to be more accurate, did not stop the run in 2024. And this is an area where there's a bit of a discrepancy between the numbers and the actual performance, in my opinion, because if you look at these statistics, the Jets only allowed 4.1 yards per rushing attempt this past season. That's better than the league average. The league average is 4.4 yards. Jets were at 4.1. In fact, this tied the Jets for the fourth best run defense if you're only looking at the statistics. Baltimore was number 1, Denver was number 2, Green Bay was number 3, and the Jets were in a four-way tie for number 4 with Minnesota, Pittsburgh, and Kansas City. So how do we, I'm sure you might be looking at this and saying, well, I thought the Jets run defense was bad. Do the numbers lie? I don't think numbers lie, but I think sometimes numbers lack context. The Jets faced the 5th most rushing attempts in the league this past season. It's not just about the number of rushing attempts you face, it's the reason you face them. And we know that the Jets were a 5-12 team. They were behind a lot. There's this old test of like how well you really understand the game. And there are statistics about, when a team runs the ball 40 times, their record is really good. And when the team passes the ball 40 times, their record's really bad. You'll hear this about like practically every team. Running the ball equates with winning. Passing the ball equates with losing. Well, the reason running the ball equates with winning is that you run the ball to try and run out the clock when you're ahead. And the reason passing a lot equates with losing is that you're always trying to throw the ball when you're behind because you're running out of time and you need to make big plays quickly. So the Jets faced a lot of rushing attempts. And a lot of these were teams just trying to close out the game, teams that really weren't that interested in gaining yardage as much as they were running the clock in situations where the Jets knew they were going to run the ball. But I think we know that when the Jets needed to get a stop against the run, they were not able to do it. We saw some disaster performances. It started week 1 in the Monday night game against San Francisco, where a 49ers team without Christian McCaffrey ran the ball at will on the Jets. We saw it week 4 against Denver when the second half, the Broncos did not have a passing game and were able to get enough points because of their ability to run the football, along with some help from the Jets offense. We saw it week 5 against Minnesota, where the Vikings ran the ball at will until Aaron Jones got injured in the first half. Over and over through the season, the Steelers just grinding out a game on Sunday Night Football by running the ball Jets against the Jets. The Monday night game in Buffalo, Bills just ran the ball at will all night, especially on the first drive where they barely needed to throw the ball. I think we know this Jets run defense was not good. And I would associate a lot of that with the defensive tackle play. Again, I think a lot of the Jets' struggles on defense were about the defensive tackle play because the linebackers were both good. I mean, you saw it. Jamie Sherwood was the team MVP. He was voted the MVP by his teammates. Quincy Williams had a good season. He wasn't quite the first team All-Pro he was in 2023, but I don't think you can say he had a bad season. I mean, both Williams and Sherwood were top 11 in run stops, and run stops are run plays that result in a failure for the offense. The issues were on the defensive line because the Jets just got annihilated up front. And look, part of this was, I would go back to what I said in the first segment. I think part of it was the issues with the pass rush, losing Jermaine Johnson early and Hassan Reddick, for half the season being a no-show who wasn't with the team and the other half being a no-show who was with the team, forced the Jets to give Will McDonald more snaps than was ideal. McDonald's a guy who probably should play on obvious passing downs when the threat of the run's off the table. McDonald's a guy who just gets pushed around a lot in the run game. To the stuff that wasn't defensive tackle issue, some of it was Will McDonald playing too much. But again, I don't want to pin everything on Javon Kinlaw, but this was just a truly dreadful signing. I mean, there were plays. It was unbelievable to watch the way Javon Kinlaw would get wiped out against the run. And again, it wasn't linebacker play. When the Jets actually stopped the run, it was usually because those linebackers were making plays. It was usually because the Jets had 2 of the top 11 run-stopping linebackers in the league, or at least 2 of the top 11 at one important statistic. Sherwood and Williams were both quite good. The issues were on the defensive line, just those guys consistently getting wiped out. So, look, again, I'm a big fan of the idea of the Jets drafting Mason Graham. One of the things the Jets have done through the years with Quinnen Williams is I think they've kind of tried to moneyball the defensive tackle spot. I think their theory's kind of been Quinnen Williams is going to draw a lot of double teams. He's good enough to beat them. And you put him next to a guy, pretty much any decent defensive tackle in the league. If you give him a lot of one-on-ones, he's going to produce. And it worked pretty well for a couple of years. It worked well with Sheldon Rankins in 2022. It worked pretty well with Quinton Jefferson in 2023. But this past season, we saw the limits of this when you had Javon Kinlaw and Leki Fatu, guys who really just struggled against the run. And another aspect of this, I'll say, is I think the safety position had a rough time for the Jets. Tony Adams and Chuck Clark did not do a great job. Tony Adams, I don't want to be too critical of, because I do feel like to a certain extent, you could argue Tony Adams is actually kind of worth it for the Jets because he was an undrafted free agent. He's not a complete disaster out there. He's a guy who's not making much money. And, sometimes if you have a guy who's not making a ton of money, who's a non-drafted free agent, if he's the 11th best guy in your defense, you can live with him not being all that great. I do think Chuck Clark was a disappointment. And I have to admit, I thought it was a great trade when the Jets got him in 2023 from Baltimore. They really did not give up all that much for him. But I don't know whether it was the injury, because he suffered an injury that cost him the full 2023 season. Maybe he didn't recover for it, or maybe his play just declined. But Chuck Clark did not really give the Jets much at the safety position this past season, and I think that was true in the run game. I think that there were a number of instances where those two safeties kind of struggled against the run. So I think again, when in the first segment I talked about the need to upgrade at the defensive end spot, that means a guy who can play three downs. Jermaine Johnson can play three downs. The other defensive end spot, I don't think you really have anybody who can play three downs at this point. You have a guy who's a good designated pass rusher in McDonald. And then beyond that, I think the Jets really need to reassess how they deal with the defensive end spot across from Quinnen Williams in this new regime. I think that there's an argument to be made for the way the Jets handled it under Asala and Ulbrich and Joe Douglas, that, it doesn't really matter who you have next to Quinnen Williams because he couldn't make anybody look good next to him. But I think the counters to that is, if you have a really talented guy next to Quinnen Williams, first of all, he's going to just dominate if he gets one-on-one blocks. But second of all, offenses are going to have a tougher time dedicating a full slate of double teams to Quinnen Williams. Occasionally they'll have to double team the other guy, and that'll open up Quinnen Williams for one-on-one opportunities. So all of this is to say, I think, I see what the numbers say, but sometimes you have to put the numbers in context. I don't think you can say the Jets' run defense was good. And I think personnel-wise, there are a number of things that this team is going to have to improve upon. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll close out our deep dive on the Jets defense. We'll talk about how the Jets did in coverage last year, and not just how they did last year, but how they may need to replace a key part of those coverage units, especially because of the new system they're putting in. We'll dive into all that as we continue here on this Friday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature helps you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you could place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, well, that's the icing on the cake. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by Prize Picks. The big game's almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, Prize Picks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. Here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least two player projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. Prize Picks even has a free pick for the big game, where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw for 1 yard to win. Pair that with one more correct pick, and you're cashing out. You can also check out the promos tab to tail any of the sweet super Millie winners big game lineups. If you tail a lineup that goes 3 for 3, you can win a split of $1 million in promo funds. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Friday, we're taking a deep dive on the New York Jets 2024 defense and looking ahead to 2025 to try and figure out priorities for the way this team should address this offseason on the defensive side of the ball. We're going to finish by talking about the coverage unit. Now, I'm not as focused on the 2024 stats on the coverage unit at the corner position, and I'll explain why in a bit, but I do think there were some interesting numbers at other spots. I think that I looked at the Jets defense against receiving tight ends and receiving running backs. And the Jets actually were top 10 in yards allowed in both spots. And I think that speaks again to quality linebacker play. You have Quincy Williams, who's one of the fastest guys in the league, a guy who's a true sideline to sideline run linebacker, but also a guy who's pretty solid in coverage. And after him, you replace CJ Mosley with Jamie Sherwood. And, CJ Mosley, a lot of good things you could say about him. Great leader, great locker room guy. Guy very solid against the run, but I think we all know CJ Mosley, especially at this point in his career, is not a great coverage guy. Jets replaced him this year because Mosley was injured. Jamie Sherwood took the bulk of the starting role from Mosley because of all of Mosley's injuries. And I think, you have a converted safety. That's usually going to be an upgrade at the linebacker position. Safeties generally have better coverage skills than linebackers because if you're the safety of the last line of defense, linebackers usually have the safeties over the top, so they don't have to be quite as good. And I do think that was an upgrade for the Jets, and I think that might reflect in why they were effective playing running backs and tight ends in coverage. Now, when we talk about the corners, things are going to change this year. I think, first of all, because the Jets are going to be a much more man-heavy team. Aaron Glenn likes to blitz a lot. When you blitz a lot, you have to play man coverage because to play zone, you need a lot of guys in the back of the defense to clog the passing lanes. There's a lot of field to cover if you're playing zone, and zone essentially means you're covering an area. Well, if you don't have enough guys to play deep in zones, they're just too big for guys to be able to cover. So you have to play more man-to-man. And I think you'll see a lot more man-to-man. Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich, they were not guys who were prone to blitzing. They like to rush forward, play a lot of coverage. With Aaron Glenn, I think the secondary is going to be the most important spot on the team, especially the corner position. With Saleh, it was the defensive line because they rush forward. If you rush forward, you need to have talented defensive linemen. If you blitz a lot, you need guys who can hold up one-on-one. And the Jets have one of the most talented corners in the league in Sauce Gardner. Now, maybe he didn't show it this past season, but Sauce, I think the Jets will be looking for Sauce to round back into form with Aaron Glenn as their coach. And, there were a lot of guys who underperformed this year for the Jets. It wasn't just Sauce Gardner. And part of me wonders, how much of this team was just caught in the undertow of the dysfunction, all of the chaos that reigned around this team, from the crazy in-season moves to the firing of the coach to Jeff Ulbrich needing to be the head coach and the defensive coordinator. There was a lot going on. And, we'll see what happens this year, but I'm kind of inclined to give some guys a pass, and maybe I shouldn't, but I kind of am anticipating Sauce Gardner returning to form this season. And it will be important. And part of the reason it will be important is that Jets' number 2 corner, a guy they've really relied on, and the spot where they'll rely on even more, DJ Reed, it sounds like he's going to leave. Now, we've talked about this a little bit on the show over the last couple of days, that DJ Reed before the end of the season was just saying, I can't wait to get out of here. Now, I guess it's possible, like with Aaron Glenn back in the mix. Aaron Glenn's apparently a very popular guy, players coach, and if you caught his introductory press conference, I think you can understand why. I mean, I was fired by Aaron Glenn's press conference. I was ready to go play for the Jets when Aaron Glenn gave that press conference. Really great motivator. But at this point, it sounds like DJ Reed just wants to be done with the Jets. And maybe Glenn can change it, maybe he can't. But if he can't, then it becomes important to find a number 2 corner. Right now, the Jets don't have a number 2 corner. And the guy who, I guess, the next guy up would be Brandon Echols, who's about to hit free agency. And I like Brandon Echols. I just mentioned him the other day on a show I did that, he'd be a guy I'd look to re-sign. But I don't think Brandon Echols is a number 2 corner in this league. I think he's number 4 or 5 corner that maybe you can play him for a week or two without getting exposed. I don't think he can be a starter. And I especially don't think he can be a quality starter in a defense where you got to play a lot of man-to-man. I think Echols is probably better zone than he is a man-to-man corner. So that is going to be a huge priority spot this offseason for the Jets. We've talked about defensive tackle. Defensive tackle next to Quinnen Williams is really important because Jets really had nothing next to Quinnen. And the one issue that didn't only popped up a couple of times is when Quinnen Williams goes down and you don't have any good defensive tackle around, then you get really exposed because then they had to play Solomon Thomas a lot. They had to play Kinlaw more than they wanted to. It just was not a good situation. So obviously Solomon Thomas is not coming back with Saleh gone, but Jets need to upgrade the defensive tackle spot. And we talked about how the Jets need to upgrade the safety spot because they just, there were just so many issues back there between Tony Adams and Chuck Clark. I mean, maybe one of the two of them could come back, but I don't think you could have that duo back again. But beyond that, going a little deeper, maybe the second most important, I put number 2 corner ahead of safety because of the importance of it in the Aaron Glenn scheme. Because Aaron Glenn's going to blitz so much, because the Jets are going to play so much man coverage, this becomes more paramount. And one of the challenges of playing man-to-man in today's game is that these spread offenses have arisen. And you see the standard personnel grouping in the league is now a 3 receiver set, and most teams don't have 3 corners who can cover one-on-one. The Jets have Sauce Gardner. They have Michael Carter II, who was excellent in 2022 and 2023 and had a really big down year in 2024, which coincided with him getting paid. But I also think like Michael Carter II may have been playing hurt. The moments where he had to leave games, and maybe he was playing a little bang, maybe he was playing through something. And again, maybe I'm just too much of an excuse maker, but with all the dysfunction around the Jets, maybe I'm willing to give guys a pass who didn't have that great of a year. So but at the end of the day, I'm still going to be confident going into 2024 with Michael Carter II as my slot corner. The question is, who's that third corner? Will the Jets be able to talk DJ Reed into coming back? And if they do, DJ Reed's on the, he's in his late 20s. How is he going to age? So, the Jets, this is a spot I think the Jets will need to prioritize this offseason. They'll need to figure out a way to bring in a quality guy as their number 2 corner, because I think you can trust Sauce Gardner against the other team's number 1 receivers, but if the quarterback progresses to his number 2 receiver, who do you have to shut that guy down? Just don't have anybody right now, and I think that's going to be a priority. And of course, we'll discuss free agent options in the days that we had plenty as we head deeper into the offseason, as we get closer to free agency. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. Enjoy Super Bowl 59. Chiefs and Eagles will go at it on Sunday. We'll chat again on Monday.